Good morning, students. Today we are going to analyze merits and demerits of Yeats's poetry and also his achievements and contribution to English poetry. Students, Yeats is a great poet and there are various factors that are secret of his greatness and universal appeal. Yeats is great by virtue of bulk and variety of his poetry, and critics are agreed that very few of his poems can be regarded as inferior. His work is uniformly good, even he writes on such varied subjects as ancient legend, mythology, folklore, politics, history, love, and constantly makes new myths of his own. His creative range is immense and he writes with perfect ease and mastery on themes taken from every possible sphere of life, and a high standard of performance is maintained throughout. Students, T.S. Eliot has once commented that, but it must be apparent that Mr. Yeats has been and is the greatest poet of his time. Eliot comments that I cannot think of no poet, not even among the greatest, who has shown a longer period of development than Yeats. The critics are agreed that it is a sign of genius. Indeed, this sustained and continuous development of art and genius is the keynote of Yeats's poetry. The period of poetic activity in his case extended over 50 years, and during this period he was constantly becoming, maturing and growing, different from what he was in the beginning. There is no sudden change or break in continuity, but a slow evolution, and the germs of the future are to be found in what has gone before. The collected poems by Yeats form an organic whole. Each poem lights up the preceding one and is in its turn illuminated by those which follow. Students, early poetry by Yeats had some elements of pre-Raphaelite poetry. This evolution, this gradual transition is one of the chief features of Yeats's poetry. His early poetry is romantic while the later one is realistic both in theme and treatment. He began writing verse in the thinned out romantic pre-Raphaelite tradition. His early poems are frankly escapist and are heavily overhung with pre-Raphaelite tapestry. The languorous, dreamy atmosphere of this early, fairy world is accentuated by haunting rhythms. It is a world of Celtic twilight, of vague, uncertain lights, and the imagery used is equally vague and subdued in color. The use of Irish mythology and folklore took all Europe by storm, and it had a rare fascination for those who were fed up with the hackneyed classical myths and legends. Students, later poetry by Yeats is marked by realism. The turn of the century saw Yeats transformed into a great 20th century poet from a 19th century romantic. His later poetry is characterized by stark, naked realism, even brutality and coarseness, and with a masculine vigor and force. In keeping with modern realistic trends, there is greater and greater approximation to speech rhythms and colloquial diction. The bareness of style and diction, the bony structure of Yeats's poetry is combined with a rare richness and complexity of content of this later phase of Yeats's writing. Profundity of thought accompanies simplicity of form, the poetry of rich and complex, the tower and the winding stair period is a majestic utterance which stimulates and lifts up reader by its very urgency, intensity, and immediacy. The work continues to be of uniformly high standard, and there is no evidence of a decline in power even in the poems of the last phase. Such sustained evolution and uniformity of production are rare. Students, this much for today. We will continue on this topic in our next class. Thank you.